On March 18, 1990, Nissan entered the Japanese touring car championship with a new contender. After more than a decade of being humiliated on their own home turf, it was about time to set things right. And set things right, they did. Their all-new R32 GTR laid complete waste to its competition. It won every single race it entered for 4 straight years. In short, Nissan's domination was brutal and their competitors just couldn't wrap their heads around it. How did Nissan manage to create such an advanced racing machine seemingly out of thin air? The answer to this question remained hidden for almost 34 years, until a suspicious Porsche came up for auction in Florida. More specifically, a Porsche 959 with chassis number 022. It had been originally sold to a man from Belgium in 1988, except that it really wasn't. So what's the story behind this 959 and what does it have to do with the R32? First of all, let me say this. There's no chance in hell the GTR would have dominated the way it did if it hadn't been for this specific Porsche. I mean, just take a look at what Nissan was doing during the mid to late 80s. Instead of winning races and selling cars, they had become more and more burdened by bureaucracy. They had lost their focus. They had forgotten why customers had been buying their cars in the 60s and 70s. No wonder their market share slipped by almost 30% by the mid-80s. Nissan as a company was becoming irrelevant. They were failing. Their econoboxes just couldn't compete, not on the sales floor and certainly not on the racetrack. All this left Nissan with only 2 options: cut their losses, exit racing altogether, and focus on manufacturing boring cars that could be sold to the masses for cheap. Or choose to go all in and build exciting cars that win races again. Easy choice, right? Well, not really. Because there was a major shift taking place in Japan that was way beyond Nissan's control. You see, in the early 80s, touring cars in Japan looked completely wild, like this super silhouette Skyline. But after 1985, Nissan had to tone down their cars significantly, which resulted in this Skyline GT-R. So, what happened? Manufacturers were building what is known as silhouette race cars. In short, they were slopping shells that kind of resembled production cars onto heavily modified Formula racing tech. Which means this super silhouette Skyline has exactly nothing in common with an R31 Skyline you could buy from a dealership. But in 1985, this changed. Japanese touring car racing adopted Group A rules, which put an end to the Skyline. Instead, manufacturers were forced to keep their touring cars much closer to stock. Only limited modifications and standard body kits were allowed. Sounds like a bad thing, right? Except it wasn't. Even though the race cars looked slightly more boring than before, this change in regulation was actually a massive win for manufacturers and fans alike. As a matter of fact, it led to the whole series gaining in popularity for a simple reason. As a manufacturer, if you wanted to win on the track, you had to release faster cars for the road. Suddenly, fans could root for their favorite cars on Sunday and then go to the dealership on Monday and buy a car that very closely resembled what they had seen the previous day. Good news for Nissan, right? Not exactly. The gain in popularity for the Japanese Touring Car Championship actually worsened Nissan's position dramatically. As the pie grew, so did the competition. And not only from Japan, it came to a point where BMW and Ford were basically splitting the whole pie between them. Japan as a whole just didn't have an answer to the E30 M3 and the Sierra. But there was one man who wouldn't just accept this fate. When Yutaka Kume became president of Nissan in 1985, he was 64 years old. At the time, I'm pretty sure nobody was envying him for having to take over a failing company. But as we all know, times do change, especially if you have an ambitious plan and the necessary will to force it upon reality. So how can you tackle this problem? How can you turn a juggernaut like Nissan Motor Company around from a boring brand selling boxy cars to this? And do all that in just 5 short years? Surprisingly, the answer to this question was a deep, hard look into the past. You see, Yutaka Kume could still remember what winning felt like. As a Nissan veteran who had been with the company for almost 40 years, he hadn't forgotten what the true GTR was able to do. And I'm sure Nissan's competition also had a hard time forgetting about it. More than a decade earlier, the world's first Skyline GTR had set a record that forever put its stamp on Japanese racing history. When it crossed the finish line at the 300-kilometer Fuji speed race, it had achieved something that no other car had done before or since then. This GTR secured its 50th victory over a span of just 2 years and 10 months, catapulting Nissan to the very top of motorsport, cementing the GTR badge as a legend feared by manufacturers and loved by fans. As a matter of fact, this car was so successful that the phrase "Skyline's only rival is Skyline" became a common saying among journalists and fans alike. There just wasn't any other car that could compete with the white and red GTR badge. But that was then. By the mid-80s, Nissan's reality couldn't have been further apart from the glory of the past. Except for Yutaka Kume, those memories weren't just nostalgia. Quite the opposite. The dominating performance of the Skyline GTR became his exact blueprint for Nissan's future. There was no doubt in his mind that a new GTR was the key to save the entire company, and he made sure that everybody else working at Nissan also knew. This is how Project 901 was born, a secret group inside of Nissan that was free of all the bureaucracy that had been slowing down the company for over a decade. This allowed them to operate with their eyes set on a singular, very specific goal: to create the world's best car in terms of driving performance by 1990. To Kumi-san, it was obvious. It was plain to see, if they could achieve this goal, everything else would fall into place. The GTR badge would once again rule the racetrack. Nissan would prove to the world that its motorsport DNA hadn't been lost, and most importantly, they would sell cars again, and lots of them. Sounds like a plan, right? There was only one problem though. In the late 80s, there wasn't a better place to achieve all that than the Japanese Touring Car Championship. With global interest in the series skyrocketing, everybody wanted to be a part of it, remember? So how could Nissan, who was struggling to sell cars and win races for more than a decade, suddenly compete with the Porsches, BMWs, Fords and Ferraris of the world? In other words, a true David versus Goliath battle was about to unfold. But Nissan had an ace up their sleeve. One we found out about just recently when this 959 came up for auction in Florida. You see, with Yutaka Kume taking matters in his own hands, the Project 901 team got to work immediately. Behind closed doors, they started the development of what would become the first GTR in 16 years. More specifically, the Nissan Skyline R32 GT-R. So what makes this car truly unique compared to its competition? In my opinion, it's two technological achievements that build upon each other. The first one is its engine. Instead of focusing on a lightweight build like Nissan's rivals did, Nissan went for power and reliability. The new RB26 engine gained over half a liter of displacement compared to its predecessor. It was twin turbocharged, and most of all, it was engineered for longevity. Why is longevity important in a race car, you may ask? Well, this meant that the stock 270 horsepower Nissan claimed it had could be dramatically increased without risking its failure. As a matter of fact, it could easily handle well over 600 horsepower without having to worry about the blown engine mid-race. But with the RB26 engine, Nissan kept running into a different problem, one that led directly into Nissan's second technological achievement that put it head and shoulders above the competition. A powerful engine with large displacement and twin turbos meant that the GTR was heavier than its rivals. Sure, Nissan could compensate the additional weight with raw power. But this led to a different problem though. How do you put all that power on the track without just spinning the wheels? Pretty soon it became clear that there's only one viable answer to this problem. One that could also check off Nissan's goal of creating the best performing car in the world. You see, back then all-wheel drive systems were anything but new, especially since Audi had already introduced their Quattro. But first of all, the existing all-wheel drive systems were mostly targeted towards loose surfaces like gravel. And second, no offense to Audi, but their solution wasn't very high-tech, at least if you compare it to another car, one that was built just a mere 15 miles up north from Audi's headquarters in Germany. Dr. Helmut Bott, chief of Porsche's R&D division, had come to a very similar conclusion as Nissan's Project 901 team. An all-wheel drive system was the key to unlocking the next level in high-performance sports cars. But for that to happen, the tech behind it had to be pushed way further than what Audi had done with their Quattro. Instead of just distributing torque equally between both axles, Porsche's team came up with an ingenious solution: adapt the distribution of torque dynamically with changing road conditions. This very idea laid the groundwork for one of the finest Porsches ever built, the 959. In it, a computer gathered engine and wheel speed data to calculate the current weight distribution at each axle. As a result, during hard acceleration, torque shifts as much as 80% to the rear. This matches the weight transfer of the car. But when you're going in a straight line, torque distribution settles at 60% rear and 40% front, matching the static weight distribution of the 959. And at least 20% of torque is sent to the front axle at all times to improve steering precision and stability. In short, Porsche had achieved something that no one else had done before. Naturally, it had cost Porsche a lot of money to not just invent such an advanced tech, but create a complete car around it. The 959 was their pride and joy, the most advanced car Porsche had ever built. And naturally, Nissan was very interested to find out how it worked, given their ambitions with their Project 901 and the upcoming GTR. But how could they get their hands on a Porsche 959, a car that was never officially sold in Japan? First, they kindly asked Porsche if they could have one of those rare 959s and take a good hard look at the tech underneath it. Obviously, Porsche declined. Not really a surprising answer, right? But Nissan didn't just give up like that. Instead, one of their executives got in contact with a man that was distributing luxury cars in Belgium. Through this contact, Nissan managed to buy a silver 959 Comfort with chassis number 022 from Porsche. Without ever getting titled or registered, this car was immediately put into a container and shipped to Yokohama. As soon as it arrived, it was completely torn to pieces, and Nissan's engineers just couldn't believe the gold mine they had stumbled upon. But what happened next is not what you might expect. This story could have ended with Nissan just blatantly copying what Porsche had painstakingly developed. But to Nissan's credit, it doesn't. Far from it. Remember the main goal Project 901 set out to achieve? To create the world's best car in terms of driving performance. Now, how can you do that if you just copy what your competition is doing? You just can't. So Nissan's engineers had to push the tech they found in the 959 even further. And push further they did. They've created an all-wheel drive system named Attesa E-TS. And just to give you an idea of how advanced it was, consider this. It took BMW and Mercedes almost 30 years to come up with comparable tech under their xDrive and 4MATIC labels. So what is it that made Nissan's all-wheel drive system so advanced? Just like in the 959, the GTR also uses engine and wheel speed data to adjust the distribution of torque. But in addition to that, it also relies on data by the ABS system and 3 G sensors. So for starters, the GTR just has more data to work with, but there was also a difference in its operating principles. Torque is always sent just to the rear axle, except when the rear starts to lose grip. Only then it starts sending torque towards the front axle. But there's even more to it. Because when lateral forces increase, torque to the front is reduced, no matter if the rear loses grip or not. You can probably guess when this comes in handy on the track, right? The bottom line is this: you can maintain higher speeds through the corner and get back on the throttle earlier. And when Nissan unleashed this tech onto the world, there just wasn't any other all-wheel drive system that worked like that, not even the 959s. Combined with its twin-turbocharged, overpowered and nearly indestructible engine, this tech is what made the R32 GTR so devastatingly effective. And from the get-go, it was racking up first-place finishes. The once feared Japanese touring car championship instantly became a walk in the park. The GTR won every single race from 1990 to 1993. It finished first in the 1991 Spa 24 Hours race and won 3 Group A championships. And somehow the Gibson Motorsport team in Australia managed to create the absolute pinnacle of GTR builds, which dominated Bathurst throughout 91 and 1992. So much so that Nissan Japan kindly asked them not to enter the Australian R32 build into Japanese races. By the way, during this run, its nickname was coined by an Australian journalist. Godzilla. But if you ask me, the story ends on a bitter note. Have you noticed that Nissan managed to get their hands on a silver 959 Comfort? And the one that was auctioned off in Florida was a green SC? After Nissan was done disassembling and studying the 959, they discreetly transferred ownership of the car to one of the project engineers. This engineer never registered it, which means the car most likely was never driven on public roads. And for that matter, it was barely driven anywhere, because somehow, when the car made its way to the United States, it had just 1,197 miles on the odometer. And there, it was rebuilt into a 959 SC resto mod. In my opinion, a car that spawned not only every modern 911 Turbo, but also every Nissan GTR since the 90s, kinda would have deserved to be kept in its original form. Let me know in the comments how you feel about this.